Hello and welcome to another Clip Studio Paint tutorial. In this occasion I will show you how to create an animated Halloween card using some of the functions of Clip Studio Paint EX, such as 3D objects, special brushes, materials from Clip Studio assets, and keyframe for animation. First, let's create the canvas. I decided on a square canvas of 1080 pixels that will work great in social media. And also I choose a timeline of 24 FPS with a length of 8 seconds, but we can change it later, so don't worry. To create the initial concept, first I gather a lot of reference and inspiration from around the web. I prepare a mood board with color palettes and elements, and I also gather the assets I will need from Clip Studio Assets to complete the final result. I use typical Halloween elements, such as carved pumpkins, a ghost and a grave, and also a coffin. I also added a black cat to animate the eyes. And for the text, I choose a font inspired on old Gothic typeface. Here you see me sketching the ghost. The idea is that it will float from the coffin and then the text will reveal. It's a simple animation, but I will try to show you different functionalities of Clip Studio. To speed up the workflow, I use 3D objects to help me create the parts of the illustration. First, I drag the coffin in the canvas and then I match the rotation and perspective using the operation tool. With the 3D object layer selected, it places it in the same layer and matches the perspective plane. Then I use the coffin and the sketch as reference and place the grave in the correct position. Then I drag the pumpkins. In this material have multiple 3D objects grouped together. I play with the position, the scale and the rotation to match the sketch. Then I bring up the subtool settings to hide the pumpkins I don't need. Then I modify the individual pumpkins to create the composition I wanted. Using 3D objects, we can easily create complex scenes. Just make sure you have the rights to use them. I imported a forest background material as a base to create the ambient and the color palette. I used the 3D layer guides to match the perspective. For my process, I will create new layers, change the blending mode, and add details. In this case, I added glowing particles, some ambient lights. Also play with the hue saturation tool to change the colors. Then I add and merge layers to achieve the ambience I want. I use the blend tool to remove some details from the background, and then I paint over the overall background with a texture brush. I will add elements to the foreground using the sketch as reference. I'm using a painterly style, so I try to keep everything in one layer. I keep sampling colors from the canvas and try to express the volume of the object, and using a texture brush I add texture to the shadows and highlights. I lock the transparent pixels of the layer to keep the edges and add texture and work inside the edges I defined earlier. I unlock the pixels and use transparent color to carve some details such as damage in the stone and added highlights to the edges. I follow the same process for all the other elements. Just define the edges, then unlock the transparent pixels, work with the overall lighting, then add a highlight and carve some damage in the objects. Since I'm using a painterly style, instead of tracing the 3D objects, I will take advantage of the textures included. I duplicate the 3D layer, then rasterize it. Then, using the selection tools, I separate each element into its own layer. I lock the pixels of the coffin layer and start the paint over process to achieve the final result. I'm using selection tools, picking colors, changing to transparent color, and using a texture brush to achieve the painterly style. I create a selection to fill the coffin with a green color to create a spooky glow. Then I duplicate the layer and play with the blending modes. Then add a Gaussian blur to create the soft glow. Play with the opacity and duplicating the layer until I achieve the final result one last time and add a motion blur. I keep the glow layer separate so I can animate the opacity later. I repeat the same steps for the grave. I try to pay attention to the light casted by the other elements. And finally I added an engraving. For the pumpkins, I start with a blender brush, achieve the painterly style base. Then I keep adding details using my texture brushes and matching the overall lighting of the scene. Again, I created a separate layer for the glow to animate it later. I paint the base, create duplicates, added the Gaussian blur and motion blur, and also play with the blending modes. I applied the same steps for the cat, just separate the eyes in another layer to animate it frame by frame. I painted the base open eye. Then I duplicate the layer and use the free transform tool to deform the eyes to make it close. For the ghost, I will create a special ribbon brush. In my last tutorial, I explained how to create a full color ribbon brush. I will expand on that concept with another settings. Please watch it for an in-depth explanation on the process. Here I just paint a base for the ghost. Then I make it a file object and open the file object. Then I separate the head from the torso and make sure the two parts are tileable. I register them as a brush tip material and I create a ribbon brush. I duplicate my robot arm brush and change some settings. I added a brush size and transparency ending to make it taper at the end and make it transparent. The last element is the Happy Halloween text. I make it with a Gothic font, then rasterize it. I create a duplicate and set it to black to create a shadow. I merged both layers, then play with the colors and brushes, adding texture. Then finally I use the mesh transform tool to create an arc and add a glow for the final effect. This is the final result. Now I'm going to animate it using simple keyframes and some frame by frame animation to finalize it. I have each layer separate and the timeline panel open. I will start by adding enable keyframe to the text layer and adding a keyframe at the start and set it to 0% opacity for now. To animate the cat eyes, first I create a new animation folder and place all the eyes layers inside the folder. Then I assign the first frame to the open eyes. Then I create the animation by assigning a new layer to close the eyes every 2 frames. After the first animation is done, I split the clip to duplicate it. Then I just play with the timing of the frames and duplicate the clips to cover the length of the animation. To animate the glow of the pumpkins, I simply enable keyframes and added a couple of keyframes for opacity every second from 100 to 0 and animate it. I did the same for the coughing glow, but from 100 to 80 to create a pulse. For the ghost, I created a mask to make it appear from inside the coffin, and then I used a combination of keyframes and frame-by-frame animation to achieve the final result. I was playing with the Rion brush in the vector layer. It was an interesting experiment. We need to take our time to combine frame-by-frame animation and keyframes to achieve more details in the movements, but overall it's a good practice. Finally, I created a simple reveal of the text layer to finish the animation. And here's the final result. I hope you can apply some of my techniques in your own work. If you have any question on the process, feel free to ask me. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.